All right, howdy everybody. We are ready for our next speaker. He is a professor at Texas Tech, so another Texan, yay. He is an author of several books, Money and the Rule of Law, The Political Economy and Distributism, and The Medieval Constitution of Liberty. And he's got a new book that's coming out this weekend, or July 4th. The Spirit of 1776, Libertarianism and American Renewal. It is Alex Salter, so give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Jack, for that nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Excellent. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited today to talk to you about a topic which I know is near and dear to your hearts and something that's especially interesting to me in recent years as well. You're probably aware that there's been an increasing public conversation about this idea of common good capitalism. Many politicians and public intellectuals have explicitly embraced a more values-oriented approach to political economy. And that conversation prompted me, starting several years ago, to write a book on distributism, engaging the works of Chesterton, Belloc, many of the canonical thinkers, against the backdrop of Catholic social teaching. My contention in this book is that distributism provides a way to operationalize and understand common good capitalism. That's the claim that I make in the book, and that's what I would like to spend the next half hour talking to you about today. Can everyone hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Excellent. So the book is published by Catholic University of America Press. It just came out in June. I was very excited for the reception it's received so far. This is technically an academic work. It's scholarly, it's sourced, but I did write the book in a way to be conversant with the proverbial intelligent layperson. So don't think that just because you don't have 3 letters after your name, you can't understand what I'm saying here. As somebody who's seen the inside of academia, I can tell you most of what we do is just made up stuff anyway. Okay, so what's the background? Many of you probably recognize this individual, the senior senator from Florida, perhaps not the most popular individual in this crowd, but nonetheless, he has in his recent remarks, his recent speeches, hit on something that does capture many feelings and sentiments among American citizens. This idea that market processes have somehow become divorced from the common good, and it is the necessary and appropriate role of public policy to reorient the market economy towards the common good. So what I largely did in this book is investigate those series of claims. I do not take a stand on common good capitalism. My good is to understand it, to explicate it, and try and figure out if it's going to work, how would it work. And so I think that when you look at the claims that many people who advocate common good capitalism want, when you look at their claims about how labor markets are rewarding the wrong kind of things, when you look at arguments about wealth concentration, when you look at many of the pathologies that many intellectuals, politicians, and other thinkers have castigated against contemporary market processes, the next immediate question that we have to ask is, okay, so what we have right now, if that's not working, what do we augment? What do we replace it with? What actual policy solution or solutions do we need to incorporate to get the economic footing of the country back on track? And that's where distributism comes in. But before I get to that, there has been a major realignment among American conservatives, which is most of the time the crowd that I spend my time talking to. But I find this very interesting because it shows a sort of fellow traveler effect going on with wide segments of the American right that impel the need for this public conversation. And what that immediately gets us is, once you realize the background of many of these thinkers who are rallying behind the flag of common good capitalism, many of them are explicitly influenced by Catholic social teaching. How many people here are familiar with Catholic social teaching? I would hope it's everybody, right? It's in your party platform. That and Kuyper, another very interesting thinker whose writings I just spent a fun weekend discussing in Holland, Michigan. So there's a lot of that common good / solidarity thinking in the economic platforms here. And if distributism is going to be the link between the value vision of common good capitalism and the concrete policy proposals that we want to see, we've got to figure out how it's going to work. We have to understand what Catholic social teaching implies for the structure of political and economic institutions. We need to figure out what the first generation distributist authors are actually saying that makes sense and what they're saying that doesn't make sense, because there are some things that they're saying that don't make sense. But there are also a lot of things in the writings that are good and valuable and that should inform contemporary policy discussions today. Whoops. There we go. Okay, let's start with the easier questions. Before we talk about what common good capitalism is, let's talk about what it's not. To begin with, common good capitalism, if it's going to be anything meaningful, is not just another form of state-regulated capitalism. It's not just another form of the welfare state. It's not just yet one more transfer program implemented by some bureaucracy in some far-off national capital. We're not talking about a third way here. You think about a third way, you have capitalism way over here, you have socialism way over here, you try and split the difference. That's not what common good capitalism is, because the way that it thinks about political and economic problems proceeds according to completely different evaluative standards than you would get from a normal public policy perspective. Again, think about what you hear in terms of contemporary indictments of markets and politics from a sort of orthodox or standard perspective, right? What's one thing that you hear a lot about? Income equality. Income inequality is a big problem, right? The inability to find work at remunerative wages, that's another problem, right? Inequality of consumption opportunities. Once you actually take a step back and embrace a holistic, values-oriented perspective, you realize that these are at most symptoms of even deeper problems. It's not just that the market rewards forms of work unequally. It's that there has been a massive transformation in the landscape of dignified work. That's the key, right? Mere inequality of outcomes is not sufficient to actually give us a materialist concern for these market processes that are occurring. The problem isn't just that you're getting paid more and you're getting paid less. The problem is the division of labor has proceeded along lines such that a major swath of the population finds it difficult to find dignified, honorable, and yes, remunerative work. It's a completely different perspective, right? If you look at the distributist authors who we're going to talk about in a second, especially Hilaire Berloc, they specifically say that they're not terribly concerned about inequality per se. They're not terribly concerned about the fact that Smith has a larger income than Jones and so can consume more stuff than Jones. They're concerned about an inequality to the axis of actual productive property, the means of actually fitting into a division of labor and conducting systematically dignifying work, which is a different problem. So in order to understand these concerns, we have to engage a new perspective in political economy, which I contend is actually a rather old perspective in political economy. This is not something revolutionary. This is not something that hasn't been said before. In fact, it's been said many times before, and perhaps it's time that we pay it some more attention than hitherto we have. A little more historical oversight. In some ways, Catholic social teaching is a bit of a misnomer since it suggests an isolated portion of the teachings of the church that didn't really exist before, right? The standard narrative that you have is the Industrial Revolution comes along and now we've got to start talking about economics and politics. There's something to that, but really the church has always applied her moral perspective to questions of economic and political organization. It is true that the Industrial Revolution impelled a new need to look at these topics in a fresh and original way. Right? What you have to say about the division of labor, specialization in trade is going to look very different when, on the one hand, 90% of the population of the country is engaged in agricultural production on their own farms versus all of a sudden everybody's moving to the city and engaging in wage labor. That presents a different set of economic problems and moral commentaries on economic problems that we do need to take seriously. So what is the key takeaway from Rerum Novarum, Quadragesimo Anno, all these papal encyclicals that outline the principles that underlie distributism? The cool thing about distributism is that it is explicitly based on Catholic social teaching. What I like to say about distributism is it's explicitly Catholic, but not uniquely Catholic. It's built on Catholic principles, but you don't have to be Catholic to appreciate the perspective on politics and economics offered by the distributist authors. So how do we think about the common good in this perspective? We all know the textbook definition, right? The sum total of conditions that enable a given human community, from the family, the local community, all the way up to the state to flourish. In order for that to happen, according to Catholic social teaching, we need several things, including solidarity among capital and labor, the availability of dignified work, just wages, all these things that we understand, but hitherto have not really been able to integrate into a policy perspective for contemporary economic issues. When we get to the distributists, though, that's when we actually get into the nitty-gritty of the institutions. That's when we can actually start talking about the rules of the political economic game. And that's what I found particularly fascinating when I was going back and rereading Chesterton and Belloc. Those are the two figures that I concentrate most on in the book because I think that they have the most to say that's original and interesting. Now, their comparative emphases are different. Belloc is much more analytical. When you read Belloc, it's kind of like reading a Thomistic tract of philosophy. He's very regimented, very logical. Chesterton is much more of an artist. He's much more imaginative and frankly much more frustrating at times, but I love reading him. It's still a personal practice of mine that every Easter I reread Orthodoxy, and every Christmas I reread Everlasting Man. Those are two works of his that I particularly enjoy. Not really relevant to distributism for the purposes of this conversation, but the prose is so excellent that I would argue that anybody who doesn't read Chesterton, you're missing something very valuable. So go out and get his books. It's good stuff. One other thing I want to mention before I get into the more detailed particulars is that on my reading of the Distributists, the central concern of distributism is, in fact, human freedom. It is not libertarian freedom. It is something else. Human freedom does not just mean I can do what I want and you can't aggress against me. It's partly that, right? But there's more to it than that. Freedom means independence. Freedom means dignity. Freedom means that nobody can impose their will on me politically or economically. Freedom means that I have the capacity to integrate myself into my community, into my society, in a way that actually upholds the prerogatives of me as a person, of the family, of the community. It's a much richer, substantive notion that mixes both positive duties and negative duties. So there's a dimension here to human freedom that is not just leave me alone, right? We're forgetting the predicate. The predicate is so I can do what I ought. Human freedom is ultimately about being able to fulfill one's duties before God, to the distributists. And if we lose sight of that, we're not going to understand why they place such an important central emphasis on property. This has been confusing to a lot of people because the distributist emphasis on property is about human freedom. It's just about a different definition of human freedom than perhaps is conversant and current in political economic discourse in the United States today. Why is it important for the distributists for private property to be widely available and widely dispersed? Right? If you wanted to summarize what the distributists say in one sentence, it's distributists like private property so much they think there should be much more of it. Why though? What is it? And by the way, I would actually reformulate that into wide access to productive resources. I think that productive resources is probably a little bit more precise way of thinking about it. I don't think it's different from what they're saying, but it's useful to frame it that way when we're engaging in temporary economic questions. What is it about widespread access to productive resources that enables human freedom? Anyone want to take a guess? Don't everybody answer at once.
It's the sort of material means of the kind of independence you're talking about, right?
There is a certain material foundation of economic independence. Just because you think that there are material foundations for a flourishing society does not make you a Marxist or a materialist. It's the simple recognition that we are embodied beings. We have a physicality. We're required to use matter. We have to sustain ourselves. And that has a material component. The whole point of widely dispersed productive property is to make sure that each household, by the way, that's the basic unit of society in the distributive scheme. It's not the individual, it's the household. That each household can sustain itself economically. That gives them the ability to resist encroachment on their proper prerogatives. If you want to understand why the family has receded in public life in recent decades, the distributists would say, what has happened to the productive household, to this idea that the family unit is not just a voluntary association, right, for mutual convenience, that there is something eternal and important and, yes, economic happening here. This is something that Chesterton, in particular, is very good on. Chesterton's works on distributism put the family front and center. The coolest thing, by the way, that Chesterton says about the family is, quote, the family is the one anarchic social institution. I just found that both fascinating and poetic. You realize anarchic, what the hell does that mean? You read what he says and he goes on to say, because Historically and morally, it is anterior to the state. There's no such thing as the state without the family, properly understood. There's no such thing as the private sector without the family. Right? The family is the pillar of anarchy on which order itself depends. But in order for that to work, in order for the family to be the means of the glue holding communities together, in order for families to actually be the way that we educate our children and integrate them into the community, it needs to be paired with this productive aspect. In order for there to be a meaningful division of labor within and across households, this economic independence has to come with it. Otherwise, we're just an agglomeration of individuals who happen to associate with each other on a basis as long as it, fulfills what I want and what you want. And if it doesn't, then we go our separate ways. That's not in any meaningful sense a family in the sense in which the distributists understand it. And that's why the family has to be front and center when we're talking about the place and role of human communities in forming even larger associations. Belloc, understandably, is very much about how the structure of property affects the overall society, and especially the character of the state. If I had to distill Belloc's argument into just a single essential point, he's basically saying that, yeah, markets are really good at creating wealth. Nobody disputes that. But creating wealth is not the same thing as creating human freedom and well-being. And the reason for that is markets, and I'm not necessarily agreeing with this claim, I'm saying that he's making it and that it's really interesting and that we should study it. Markets, Belloc claimed, have this concentrated tendency where private property is concentrated in fewer hands. That doesn't necessarily mean that living standards are falling, right? Many people who work for wage labor can actually experience rising living standards. Here's the problem with that, though. How do we maintain the character of a free state? How do we actually maintain free political institutions? What are the material prerequisites of small R republicanism, which is something that all the distributist authors are very much in favor of? Right? Let's make sure that we get our ideological preconditions right here, right? Belloc was a member of the Liberal Party in Great Britain. He was a liberal member of parliament. Chesterton described himself as a liberal and a Democrat. But their understanding of these words is not what we understand these words to mean today. So how do you actually maintain a society that, for example, is meaningfully governed by representative institutions? If democracy means anything, it means that we get together and talk about our common affairs, rather than, well, I have the guns and so we're going to do what I want to say. That's kind of what we have now, which is why it's not working terribly well. What kinds of material prerequisites are there to actually having government by discussion, government by consent? You're going to have a society of owners. You're going to have a society of people that actually care for the responsibilities of maintaining free institutions, which they understand because they have received this deposit of property that they care for, that they work with, that they intend to pass on to their children. Without that experience, without that direct responsibility of being an owner, and what comes with that, both positively and morally, we're not going to be able to actually maintain these small R Republican, small D Democratic underpinnings of our political institutions. That's Belloc's key claim. It's commonplace in the scholarly literature on economics to say that economic outcomes largely depend on prior political outcomes. You get your political institutions right, you get the rule of law, you get contract enforcement, you get all that good stuff, and then you can have nice things economically. Belloc is saying that the direction of causation sometimes runs the other way. Economic freedom, widely dispersed productive property, is itself the prerequisite for political freedom. You need a society of something like freeholders if you're going to have a free state. And why do we want a free state? Because that kind of a polity is most commensurate with the requirements of human dignity as outlined in social teaching. That's what they say. Now, there's one more figure that I survey in the work. How many of you have heard of an economist named Wilhelm Röpke? I'm seeing some hands. All right, excellent. Wilhelm Röpke was an Austrian-born German economist who's most widely known today because he was one of the major architects of the post-World War II German economic miracle. This was one of a handful of guys that basically rebuilt Germany's war-torn economy and established the German social market economy. Although he himself was Protestant, Repke was really big on Catholic social teaching. He was really big on the Distributists. And the reason that I bring him into this conversation is because I think that we can get all the great stuff about the Distributist way of thinking between political and economic institutions without some of the things that they brought to the table that I don't think are terribly relevant or valuable today. If you go and read how Belloc and Chesterton say that markets actually do work, as an economist, I think that there's a lot in there that just simply doesn't hold up, right? They say that markets work according to mechanism X. You look at it, the logic just doesn't work. That doesn't matter because that's a comparatively narrow mistake. What matters is their vision, their political economic imagination. Interestingly enough, that's actually where the conversation in scholarly circles is today, right? We're trying to figure out just what are the antecedents for the prosperity that we enjoy today. That's the big conversation, right? We understand that good stuff depends on good institutions, but where do good institutions come from? That's the ball game right now in the social sciences. And that's something that the Distributists had to offer us. Repke matters because he was a hard-nosed economist who broke no nonsense in terms of his economic theory, right? Go and read his Principles of Economics textbook. It's great. You'll get an appreciation for markets, for the price system, all this stuff that economists like me can't shut up about. We're always talking about how cool the price system is. Give me another half hour, I'll talk about how cool the price system is. But he also retained the Distributist imaginative policy vision. I highly recommend, I've recommended several works to you over the course of this talk. The one that I would tell you to go and read, the one, is a book called A Humane Economy by Wilhelm Repke. And that's when at the same time you see this combination of hard-nosed economics in the service of a broader, humane, normative political economic vision. You can be an economic scientist at the same time as a humane individual, and Repke shows us how. Go and read his policy proposals for curbing monopolies, for making sure that we have wide access to productive property, work hours legislation, all these things, right? I promise you, you're going to be impressed by what you find. The difference is Repke does these things because he has the strong economic foundations. You cannot ignore the economic foundations. If you want to fix markets and make sure that markets are oriented towards the common good, you first need to know how markets work. You can't know what a thing looks like when it's broken unless you know how it looks when it's supposed to be fixed. You gotta know how markets work. Repke took that challenge seriously. He took what he learned from the Distributists and integrated it with the state-of-the-art economic knowledge at the time to build a social philosophy that economists could really like, and even many social conservatives could really like. I'm sure that many people in this audience are familiar with a scholar named Russell Kirk, the progenitor of post-World War II American conservatism. Kirk hated economists, right? He agreed with Edmund Burke that me and my comrades were sophisters and calculators and were, waging war against the unbought grace of life. We're, just utilitarians and we're bad. That's fine, many of us are. What's really interesting, though, is Kirk wrote the foreword to Humane Economy and said, all of this is great. Kirk, who hated economists, thought this was like the bee's knees. So you have Kirk who likes it, and you have the economists who like it, and these people don't agree on anything. They agree on this. That probably tells us we should pay attention to what these groups have to say. I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, so I'll wrap up here. There is a difference between the science of economics and the art of political economy. Economics is a science. I can tell you how markets work without telling you one thing about how they should or should not work. We can study production, we can study distribution, we can study choice. But there's no reason to, unless you ultimately care or have a vision in mind of what the good society looks like. Political economy is that conversation, a conversation over the philosophical foundations of a just and humane society look like. And economics as a science is necessary for participating in that conversation, but it's not sufficient. No cost-benefit analysis ever told anybody what to do. My controversial opinion is that cost-benefit analysis is totally useless and you should just stop doing it. Not because there's no such thing as costs and benefits, but because it doesn't actually persuade anybody. Why doesn't it persuade anybody? Because it confuses the proper domain of scientific economics and artful political economy. The distributists were not always the best scientific economists. In fact, oftentimes they're pretty bad scientific economists. But they had a genius to them, a subtle imagination to them that represented, I think, some of the heights of imaginative political economy that we should take seriously today, because it's ultimately about the kinds of directions we want our policy reform to proceed in. We can ask, are the means that we've chosen in the political process appropriate for the attainment of our desired ends? That's a straightforward economics question, right? If you actually want to help low skilled workers, should I wage the minimum wage? We can argue about that, but the question has a descriptive answer. But the more important one, I think, is whether the ends themselves are worth having. And too many economists don't engage that second conversation. They think that because it's beyond the scope of economics as a science, there's nothing meaningful we can say about it at all. That has it exactly backwards. Without the destination, there's no point in any of this. Without getting the ultimate institutional foundations of social flourishing, like, there's no point in doing any of this. And that's ultimately what the distributists have to offer us. If you're looking for a vision for social reform that takes concerns about the common good seriously, while also respects that there are constraints on our behavior, that we can't have everything that we want, that we're going to have to face hard and difficult questions of trade-offs, this is the right perspective, I think, within which to have those conversations. Good timing. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to entertain some questions.
So what kinds of policies exactly are you advocating to advance this wider distribution of property?
Great question. The cheating answer is, in this book, none. And that's because this book is a philosophical explanation. But you're right. The rubber's got to hit the road at some point, right? So how do we actually advance the distributist policy agenda? What I think that the distributist policy agenda tells us is that the right way to think about these questions is not just about income transfers programs. Shuffling around purchasing power to help some people consume more is not going to solve our problems. Figuring out how the dispossessed, how the people left behind by transformations in the division of labor can be reintegrated into the national and global economy in a productive way, that's got to be the ballgame, right? We have to actually find ways to get in their hands capital that can be put to work to do something sustainable. If you look at the contemporary conversations in Washington these days, it's just about rearranging purchasing power. You don't have a job, we'll give you more money. That can't be it. That can't be it.
So what should it be?
It should be programs like, if you believe the distributist policy agenda, it should be something like cooperative arrangements to actually get small businesses up and running. That would be an example. We spend billions, if not trillions of dollars, probably not trillions, billions of dollars on corporate welfare in this country every year. Like tax breaks for huge corporations that twist the tax code because they can afford the lobbyists to do it. There's a good argument that we should have a neutral playing field economically, but if we're not going to have a neutral playing field economically, shouldn't we tilt it the other way? Something we're thinking about.
How?
What do you mean?
What specific problems, programs would tilt it the other way?
One thing that you might want to do, and this is something that the Reformicons about 10 years ago were talking about, and interestingly enough, they were shouted down for it, but now everybody's talking about it, they discovered it. Grants to relocate and retrain workers who are left behind by the division of labor, augmented by a plan to actually grant them capital to get them up and running again, right? That might be one way of fixing these problems. If you're left behind by the global division of labor through no fault of your own, and you actually want to reorient yourself towards productive enterprises, one thing that the public sector might be able to do is A, help you relocate, B, help you retrain, or C, put productive capital in your hands through a grant so you can actually get a productive enterprise up and running as soon as possible. This is not something that we've never talked about before. Right? This is something that's been on the policy agenda. The difference is 10 years ago, the people who talked about it were castigated and cast out of the conservative movement. Now people are talking about it seriously again. We should at least think about it.
One interesting debate probably more on the progressive side, is what to do about wheeling in the gig economy and that sort of thing. And I wonder how that could send up, previous conversation on the conservative side, because a lot of these, larger companies often don't treat the independent contractors well either, but it still could be an improvement for some people.
Almost certainly, right? I think that from a distributist perspective, the gig economy is a mixed blessing. Right? Because on the one hand, the ability to be an Uber driver, right? That sort of seems like an example of what they're talking about. The car that you own has become a productive asset. You can generate income with it. How secure is that income stream? How reliable is that for a foundation for family formation, for integration into the broader community? Right? Is a community of Uber drivers and gig workers going to be able to sustain representative democratic institutions? I'm not sure. Right? So it's definitely something that at the margin is probably helpful, right? All opportunities that we can find to give people more avenues to productive work using their own assets are, I think, at the margin a good thing, but that probably is not sufficient for somebody who wants to go all in on a distributist policy platform. One other thing that I want to mention, and it's going to be brought up, I'm sure, in the next section that you're going to hear, this is not something that's foreign to the American experience, by the way. A lot of people look at distributism and see it as purely a European phenomenon. This is exactly the Jefferson versus Hamilton debate on the nature and scope of the new republic, right? Are we going to be like a commercial republic that relies on high finance and manufacturing, or is it going to be a society of freeholders and local communities doing most of the governing? So these concerns, these conversations that we've been having for 200 years are very much live issues. And there's probably no final solution, right? There's always going to be need to maintain the polity, to renew it, to rebuild it, to keep it up and running. But just because a lot of the authors who are making substantive points in these conversations come from other faith traditions and or other national traditions, we have this here too. This is something that's been part of the American conversation from the beginning, so it's something that we need to face up to.
Thank you very much.